There we are. It's not showing the study screen. Oh, there it goes. How strange. Okay, but that seems to be working now. All right, just let me get things in place. We come to the end of the book of Vayikra. We are wrapping up our discussion of Leviticus, and this means we are in Behar Bechukotai. At the end of these chapters, there are a number of very important commandments to be discussed, and then many exhortations from Moses before the journey continues in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers. But here in Behar, we are going to have well, I hope, an interesting little discussion about some odd word choice, as well as a very powerful topic itself, which is the topic of Shemitah, and also the topic of Yovel, of the Jubilee. And we're not going to get into the Jubilee in too much detail, because I think, correctly or confidently anticipating we will not get quite that far in our drilling down. But as is always the case, we're going to start with the text itself. I forgot to put the extra light on. We're going to start with the text itself, and then we will look at our commentators. What will be unusual today is, since Rashbam was not adding much to this particular section in his commentary, I've replaced him for today with Ramban. Now, Ramban has an incredibly insightful commentary on the Torah. It's just very, very long and doesn't usually lend itself to a condensed discussion like we usually have. But for today, for the first few verses, there are some topics here that I think that he brings in a way that I hope the class will appreciate. So let's go ahead and get down to work with the Torah itself. Like I said, we are in Behar, which is chapter 25, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, you shall observe a Sabbath, or Shabbat, as I'm probably going to call it more often than not, of Adonai. 6 years may you sow your field, and 6 years may you prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, a Shabbat of Adonai. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest, or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Shabbat will produce for you. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. We're going to pause there, because verse 8 begins with the idea of the Jubilee, of doing 7 cycles of 7. But let's back it up. And as we've been doing lately, just a quick surface glance. What is this section trying to tell us? Well, on the very superficial way, it seems to be saying that there is a special agricultural cycle that is built into the Torah, that every 7 years, the agricultural cycle will have a Shabbat, will have a rest. The same way that we have a rest every 7 days, the land will have a rest every 7 years. And that rest means that there will not be sowing and pruning and gathering in from the produce of the land. Instead, it will be a complete rest with, apparently, superficially, no agricultural work doing. That's something obviously we're going to have to look into more detail. And of course, all of this leads to the major question of, what are we eating? What do we eat? Agriculture was the main form of sustenance, even for the small percentage of people who were not directly farmers. They still survived because someone was farming to create the wheat and vegetables and fruits that were needed to, feed yourself. So what's going on here? How are people going to be able to eat? So before we dive into the commentator, let me just give you the slightly less superficial read of this. The sabbatical cycle indeed did create a pause on the usage of the land, on the sowing and the reaping. However, there were a few things that you were allowed to do, most notably things that were necessary to maintain the health of a tree. So some things were allowed, but not things that were only designed to increase the yield, but things that just kept trees from dying, certain irrigation type things, for example. And as far as what you ate, well, you were allowed to eat from what was growing freely in the fields. Now, I don't know how many people here have been farmers or how many people have even had a good sized backyard garden, but if you plant seeds one year and then you harvest, there is a very high chance that some of what you planted will grow again the following year. No harvest, except maybe in the modern world with machinery, is 100% perfect in grabbing everything out of the dirt and not leaving anything behind. So there will be things that will grow wild in this 7th year, and that you are allowed to eat, as are everyone else, as is everyone else in the community. Meaning what happens in the 7th year most transformatively is that your land is no longer your land, and what grows from it is no longer your produce. It simply becomes the produce of the country, and everybody is allowed to eat anything from any field they happen to come across. So there is a complete removal of property rights with regards to the produce that grows wild during this time. So that would, together with what had been stored from the year prior, be enough to sustain the society until the harvest of the following year was finally able to be gathered in. That's our very short version. Now, we're going to go take a look through our Rashis. And once we're through these verses in Rashi, we're going to jump back to Ramban. So let's go ahead and see what Rashi can draw to our attention that superficially we probably missed. And that first thing is the actual name of the Torah portion, Behar Sinai, on Mount Sinai. And Rashi wants to know, what has the matter of the sabbatical year to do with Mount Sinai that Scripture, Torah, felt compelled to expressly state where it was commanded? Were not all commandments given on Sinai? Okay, so in typical Rashi fashion, he is noticing something that we might have simply glossed over. Our eyes just accepted this as being, well, that's just the opening statement. It's not the real stuff. The real stuff comes in verse 2 and is showing us that there is more going on, because, as I'm asking you to now do, reflect, do you remember other times where we hear specifically about the location in which a mitzvah was given? It is not a common occurrence. It's not unprecedented either, but it's not common. And Rashi wants to ask, well, Rashi channeling the Midrash of centuries before him, why in this particular case is Mount Sinai being mentioned when, after all of the commandments came from Mount Sinai? I mean, you could begin any commandment with, and God told Moses at Mount Sinai, and you'd be okay. Maybe the daughters of Slophachad, which gets discussed, after the fact, but by and large, at Mount Sinai is the preamble for every commandment. Why is the commandment here for sabbatical years being signaled out? And Rashi will bring his interpretation of the Midrash. But this statement is intended to suggest the following comparison. So there's something that we should be thinking about when we hear this. How is it in the case of the law of Shemitah? Its general rules, its specific prescriptions, and minute details were ordained on Mount Sinai. So also were all the commandments with their general rules and their minute details ordained on Mount Sinai. So this, you have to bear with me because he's starting off here a little slow. He's saying, because we are being told about Shemitah, and we are getting both its general precepts as well as many of the details of it, and we're told that it happened at Mount Sinai, this is meant to remind us that indeed, even for other commandments, that it may not be as obvious that both the general and the specific were being taught at Mount Sinai. More on that in a second. Thus, it is taught in Torat Kohanim, also known as Sifra, the collection of midrashim on the book of Leviticus from the early rabbinic period. It seems to me that the following is the explanation of this. Since we do not find in Deuteronomy that the law concerning the rest of the soil in the sabbatical year, Shemitah, was repeated in the fields of Moab, which is the catchphrase for Deuteronomy 34, that whole summary section reminding us that Moses's final addresses were being taught to the generation about to enter the land of Israel, which were now located on the fields of Moab on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. And if you look in that section, you will find that the sabbatical year is not discussed with regards to the resting of the land in the way that it is discussed here. So, because it was discussed here but not discussed there, we may infer that all its general rules and specific prescriptions must have been promulgated on Sinai. The express mention of Behar Sinai on Mount Sinai here appears therefore to be unnecessary, meaning if it wasn't repeated with any additional information, then surely that meant that the information we had received here must have been the comprehensive explanation, which means using the words Behar Sinai seems rather unnecessary. We know it was taught only at Behar Sinai because it wasn't included in the address by Moses 40 years later. But Scripture here, by mentioning it, intends to teach regarding every divine command that was spoken by Moses, that in every case, their general rule and minute details originated at Sinai, and that they were only repeated again in the fields of Moab. So, follow if you will. Rashi, based on his interpretation of the Midrash and Sifra, is saying the following. The Shemitah laws regarding the land are mentioned here in chapter 25 of Leviticus, but are not mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy as part of Moses's statement of the commandments to the generation about to enter the land of Israel. Now, that could imply to us that it didn't need to be stated there because everything about it, and only it, had been discussed back in Leviticus 25. But that would also imply that the things that Moses was teaching on the fields of Moab before the people went into the land of Israel were, or rather did, contain new information, that there were new details to the commandments that the people had not been given at the time of Mount Sinai. However, because our verse here in chapter 25 expressly uses the phrase on the mountain of Sinai, that is telling us that indeed every commandment, whether it was mentioned explicitly here or whether it was mentioned explicitly in Deuteronomy, all of those have the equal status of having been taught in both general and specific detail at Mount Sinai. Now, it's often the case, midrashim are not immediately compelling to everybody who comes across them, but recognize that what the midrash is wrestling with is this seemingly superfluous phrase, Behar Sinai, on Mount Sinai. It doesn't seem to add anything here, and it doesn't seem to make sense that this of all of the mitzvot would be singled out. Now, we are going to loop back later and look at Ramban's much more elaborate discussion, but don't worry about forgetting Rashi, because Ramban, in his usual way, will include Rashi before disagreeing with him. So if you're not 100% convinced by Rashi's explanation, don't worry, we've got a version number 2 coming up in a little bit. Okay, let's move on through Rashi, as I promised, hitting verse number 2 from chapter 25. So this is focusing on what's called the Dibur HaMatil, the word that is the opening of the commentary, the Shabbat Ladonai, and this, excuse me, this idea of what does it mean? Now, I guess I should have reminded you all of this before, but the word Shabbat does not just mean the seventh day. the word Shabbat comes from the verb that's used extensively throughout this section, meaning to cease or to rest. Now that becomes complicated in the translation because that's what the word Sabbath means, but it's also very easy to think of Sabbath or Shabbat as only being the seventh day, rather than recognizing that both the seventh day as well as the usage of the word here in the sabbatical discussion is coming from that same original word, meaning to cease and to stop labor. Okay, so with that in mind, let's unpack Rashi's commentary here about why is this being called a Shabbat Ladonai? Why is this being called a Sabbath, a rest for Adonai? This means a rest in honor of the Lord, not a rest for the Lord. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, this good old lamed prefix and preposition can mean lots of different things. It can mean to, it can mean for, it can mean of. There are lots of different ways to render this into English. And likewise, in the Hebrew grammar, it can have various functions in a sentence. Rashi here, based off Sifra again, is going for the function that this means this is in honor of, for him, not like to him, which means in the same sense as these words are used in the case of a weekly Shabbat, like the Shabbat of creation, where we talk about in Exodus 20, where it says Shabbat Ladonai. That cannot mean a day for God to rest. So what is he trying to say? He is saying if we're calling it a Shabbat Ladonai, we're not saying this is a rest for God, meaning God is taking it easy. We are saying this is a rest that is of God, meaning of an origin in order that we show honor to God by observing the rest. It would, another way in English, you might say, like, if you said this was a party for Tom, that doesn't mean that only Tom has the party. It doesn't necessarily mean that Tom is actually partying hard. Tom may not even be there. That may be in Tom's honor in absentia. And certainly when it comes to God, God is not partying, God is not resting, but this is done in honor of God, in observance of the commandments that we were given. Does that make sense? Again, we are going to loop back to another way of understanding this when we get to Ramban, but as those are quite extensive, I want to continue the thread through Rashi first. But any question on Rashi's refinement there? Okay. Moving down to verse 4, let's get that lined up. So we are again talking about this idea of a rest, and that this will be a Shabbat Shabbaton Yeh La'aretz, that this will be a complete Shabbat, a super Shabbat, a Shabbat Shabbat. The Hebrew doesn't really fit into an English idiom expression very well. And here we see La'aretz, for the land. Now notice, same preposition as we had for Ladonai back in verse 2, but here we are using the first as being for the land. We're also going to get Ladonai as the next two words after this, and that can make it so confusing. So Rashi tries to help us. This Yeh La'aretz, that this is a rest for the land, this means for the fields and for the vineyards. Now, this again is saying here the rest actually will be completed by the land, meaning the land itself is taking the rest, not that this is a rest in honor of the land. For the land is not deified in Jewish belief. We protect and care for the land, but we do not revere it as being part of a pantheon. And then he goes on to help us with this last phrase of lo tizmor, of do not prune the vineyard, is the translation here for our JPS version. Well, it's going to be a little bit tricky because we're going to do just a little bit of grammar. Don't worry. The word is a denominative verb from the word for branch, and it denotes to do something to the branches, which here means because one lops off the branches. That's what pruning is. Now, the translation of the Targum in Aramaic is you shall not cut off, which confirms the idea that this is some sort of pruning action. And this root has a similar meaning to the different words here that he gives in Hebrew. So what he's trying to help us understand is that this phrase lo tizmor is a little ambiguous by itself. There are a couple different ways to understand that word, but thanks to its basic root connected to the word branch, and thanks to the translation of earlier commentators like the Targum, we can understand that this actually means pruning or cutting the branches, and that unpacks it. So sometimes these little grammatical insights are how we end up with our translations in our modern books. I know that's always tempting to think that somebody can just sit down and translate the Torah and all the words are obviously clear and make sense, but that's not how language works. Language has to be transmitted of what is the usage, and especially what is the usage in this circumstance. And that's what Rashi is trying to help us with here. Moving on to verse 5. Second. So that which grows of its own of accord of your harvest. Right? So what does this mean? Even if you have not sown it, but it grew from the seeds which fell into it at the time of the harvest. And that is what the term here, Sefiach, is trying to describe. That even if you have not sown, but it's just coming back from the seed. Now, I said earlier that sort of growth is going to be okay, but what is going to be changed here is what it actually means to harvest. That there is a difference between gathering and reaping. And that's what's going to be brought up here in the second commentary of Rashi, where he says this, lo tiktsor, do not reap. You shall not reap it, meaning you shall not take it as your exclusive property, as you do with other harvests, meaning with the harvests in another year. But it shall be free, hefker, to all, and then you also may reap of it. So the idea is, like I mentioned in the introduction, that the aftergrowth can be gathered, but it cannot be harvested. It cannot be reaped. Now, that may not make a lot of sense to us modern people who don't farm an awful lot, but this is the equivalent of going out, let's just use a home garden, for example, and you're going to have a tomato salad today. So you go out to your backyard, you pick a tomato, you bring it in, you cut it up, you eat it for your salad. That's gathering a produce from your garden. Harvesting would be to go out and pull every tomato off of the plant, because all of those tomatoes now belong to you, and they're going into your house, and you're going to either use them or pickle them or turn them into sauces or whatever it might be. But you have the right in a normal year to bring all of your produce in and store it and use it. When you are gathering during the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, you can only gather what you are actually using at that time. That way, everything else that's there in the field is still available for everyone else. You have no right to clean the field out and put everything into your storage. You only have the right to go out and gather what you're eating meal by meal, day by day for your use. And everyone else is the same. Hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. And then Rashi continues with this idea of the limitations and permissions here for our Nazirecha, for the grapes that are on the untrimmed vines, those from which you barred people, meaning normally that you would keep people from having, and from which you kept them away, not having declared them free to everyone. Right? Normally, your vineyard is your vineyard. And if you see someone, jump on the fence and coming inside and taking your produce, well, that's a form of theft under most circumstances. So you are absolutely allowed to tell people, no trespassing, these are my grapes. But you can't do that during the sabbatical. During the sabbatical, they're not your grapes anymore. Your vines, even if you've just left them untended and they are growing, they are producing food that is available for everyone. You are welcome to gather, meaning you can take what you actually want, but you cannot harvest everything you want. And That's why we're going to finish up here in the fourth commentary of Rashi on this phrase, lo tiftzor, you shall not gather, meaning them, you shall not gather them, thou must not gather, but you may gather from that which has been declared free to everybody. So as long as everybody knows, you especially, that everything growing on your land does not belong to you during that sabbatical year, but is indeed hefker, it is ownerless and available to any who wish it, then you can be like anyone, and you are allowed to eat from it as well. Questions or comments? Okay, let's go ahead and do a little bit more into verse 6, get that up into place. Checking my time. All right. And the Sabbath of the land shall be food for you. All right. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce, which is a slightly easier translation. You can see why the JPS wanted to update the English. Although I have forbidden them, the fruits of the sabbatical year, although I have forbidden them to you by stating you shall not harvest, I do not mean to forbid to them to you as food or to be used for any other beneficial purpose. But what I meant was that you should not comport yourself in respect to them as the exclusive owner, but all must be equal as regards it, meaning the produce of the sabbatical year, you and your hired servant and your sojourner. So what Rashi is now making clear all the way down here in verse 6 is what I tried to give you in the intro, which you are allowed to eat these things, but only if you take it as your food, but not take it as my property, which I get to take and hide away for just myself. And here he makes that very explicit through verse 6's style, that it is, you may eat, but so will everyone else, including the ger, meaning the sojourner, those that have no hereditary portion in land. Everybody from the greatest to the least are equal during the sabbatical year and are able to benefit equally from the land that is around them. Rashi continues to show us another nuance here. So since the Torah does not state Vayita tibuat haaretz lachem le'ochla, which would be, and this will be the produce of the, and it will be the produce of the land for you that you will eat, but instead Vayita Shabbat haaretz lachem le'ochla, which means, and it shall be the sabbatical of the land that will be for you to eat. Notice that there is this gap of the actual word food in the way the Torah itself is written. The Torah doesn't say the word produce for this first clause. The Torah says it will be the sabbatical of the land that you will eat. No, I don't know about you, but I can't actually eat the sabbatical of the land. I can't eat the rest of the land, meaning, cessation of the land. I want to eat produce. So what's going on with this unusual word choice? Well, because it wasn't written the way we expected, it must be trying to tell us something that we maybe didn't expect. Instead, it intimates only that which has been treated according to the sabbatical law and been declared free to all may you eat, but not that which has been kept by you. So by using this unusual phrase, the Shabbat haaretz, rather than Tevuat haaretz, rather than the produce of the land, it is highlighting that the produce of the land during the sabbatical year is only available to you if it has been declared sabbatical produce, meaning produce that is free for everyone and not reserved just for me. So the language of the Torah is refining our reading. And again, if we were just reading superficially, if we were just reading casually, if we just went with our first instinct of what we thought the verse meant, most of us would miss that type of nuance. Again, this is the blessing of having good commentary. And Rashi continues, and the Sabbath of the land shall be food for you, for thee, and for your servant, and for your maidservant. Because it states, back in Exodus 23, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie still, that the needy of your people may eat, one might think, which means you're wrong, that they, the fruits of the sabbatical year, are forbidden as food for the rich, and thus also for the owner of the field and his household. So what is our mistaken assumption? If we only had the verse in Exodus 23, which told us that the sabbatical produce was for the poor, we might think that it meant exclusively for the poor, that only if you were below a certain income level, to use a modern phrase, that you were allowed to eat sabbatical produce. But here it is very explicit. The Torah says, it shall be food for you, for your servant, and for your maidservant. Thus, you have the mention of the owners, the rich, meaning the people who own the land, here as well as the servants and the maidservants, and thus the poor. So we are given a longer list here, which makes it clear that the rich as well will have access to the sabbatical growth as long as they are not trying to monopolize it. And this is really one of the underlying themes of the entirety of the sabbatical through this law, as well as the laws of remission of debts, the notion being that all of us, from the wealthiest to the least wealthy, should see the blessings of the earth as ultimately belonging to all of us. Yes, for different times at different periods, some of us may be in possession of more or of less of those blessings. Some will be richer and some will be poorer. But one, we should never forget that we are all still basically fundamentally the same and basically fundamentally given the same legitimate claim to the land. But during the seventh year, we will truly treat each other as being the same. The rich and the poor alike will be gathering from the field at the same time and in the same way. And that is meant to really show that that equality, that bonding, that cohesiveness of a society, that there shouldn't be some separation of classes or stratification. Judaism has no problem with private property, has no problem with personal wealth, but it does have a problem if it leads to arrogance, and especially if it leads to neglect of others. And then he finally points out in the final lines of this verse that as it includes that phrase hagarim, the bound laborers, the stranger that dwells among you, many different ways to translate that, that this is referring here to even non-Jews. Sometimes the ger toshav can mean somebody who is converted or in the process of converting, but sometimes it will just mean those who are not Jewish, but who do live within the Jewish settlements. And that's what it's being used here, says Rashi, and indeed says the Mishnah, Midrash. And that means that we open up the fields for everyone. This is not a benefit in the sabbatical year just for the Jewish community. This is meant to be a benefit for the human community. And would that theme was more strongly attached to by everyone. Okay, I'm going to actually go ahead and we're going to stop Rashi here. You can read the commentary on verse 7 and go on into the discussion of the Jubilee on your own. But I want to make sure that we have enough time for Ramban. And like I said, the reason I don't often bring Ramban's commentary, or that I will often heavily shorten it, is because it's long. But sometimes it's really worth it to look at it in its fuller version. Now, I'm going to go ahead and close Rashi to give us a little bit more room here for our Ramban, because it's going to make it easier to read. It's like I said, he's got a lot of words. Let's get ourselves back up to verse 1, because he is going to review Rashi's interpretation of that phrase Behar Sinai, and then he is going to criticize it and go on his own way. And yes, if you've ever wondered, are you allowed to argue with Rashi? It's not only his grandson Rashbam who does, but most other commentators will say things that are different than Rashi from at least time to time, if not almost every time, because there are multiple layers and means to understand and expand upon the Torah. It doesn't mean that they are opposed to each other. It doesn't mean that they are antagonistic. Indeed, in classical printings of the Jewish Torah, there will be commentators all over the page, most of whom do not agree with everyone else on the page. And that's how we should. We should be able to cohabit on the page, share our opinions, and stay together. Okay, Ramban. And the Eternal spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, or on Mount Sinai. Okay, let's just see if this sounds familiar. What has the subject of the sabbatical year, stated here in this section, to do with that of Mount Sinai? Were not all the commandments declared on Sinai? It is to teach us that just as this law of the sabbatical year was ordained on Sinai with its general rules, its specific prescripts, and its minute details, so also were all the commandments ordained on Sinai with their general rules and their specific prescripts and their minute details. Am I back? Hello? Okay, maybe it's reconnected. Let's click share screen again. Let's see if it's back up. Maybe my patience was rewarded. The question is that going to sync up with what's happening on YouTube? Well, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and keep talking. Hopefully it won't crash again. If it does, all bets are off. But let's see if we can't keep going, and maybe what's going on with YouTube will work. Maybe it won't. Okay. Well, so let's go ahead and pick up where I think it died, and pick up with "it appears to me." And if you haven't noticed, there are these little footnotes which will you can open up when you're going through different parts of Sepharia. And here it's reminding us that, as he will say later on, that the "appears to me" was the commentary we got from Rashi. It appears to me that the following is the interpretation of the Midrash right above. Since we do not find the laws of the resting of the soil repeated in the plains of Moab, we must deduce that all the general rules and specific prescripts of the sabbatical year, including those of resting of the soil, were declared on Sinai. Why then was it necessary for scriptural to state here in Mount Sinai, since it is self-understood that this entire law was promulgated on Sinai? Since the law of the resting of the soil is not mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy? Well, we must say that the reason scripture mentioned the phrase in Mount Sinai here is in order to teach that every communication, every commandment that was spoken to Moses on Sinai was given at Sinai together with its general rules and minute details, and they were merely repeated and taught again in the plains of Moab. Thus far is the language of Rashi. But, says Ramban, this does not appear to me to be correct at all. Fourth, there are many commandments like the sabbatical year, which were not repeated in the plains of Moab, meaning in Deuteronomy. And all we know about their general rules and specific prescripts is that they were promulgated either on Sinai or in the tent of meeting, but not specifically on Sinai, as Rashi said. Moreover, how do we know that the other commandments which were repeated in the plains of Moab are to be likened to the sabbatical year, which was not repeated? What are you using as the linkage for making that comparison? Perhaps this analogy applies only to those commandments which were not repeated in the plains of Moab, like the sabbatical year. So you might say, if this is your rule of thumb, that anything not mentioned in Moab was mentioned only at Mount Sinai. But what about things that were mentioned in Moab? Perhaps they don't follow that pattern and they were taught later in different ways. So, but how do we know that the analogy applies also to those that were repeated by Moses in the plains of Moab as contained in the book of Deuteronomy? And how do we know that in the case of those commandments that were repeated by Moses, that only the general rules were declared on Sinai, but the specific prescripts were given in the plains of Moab? And indeed, it would be more logical to say so, that those commandments which were repeated by Moses were restated for the sake of explaining their specific prescripts, since on Sinai only their general rules have been declared. So Ramban is attacking Rashi's logic. He is saying, I understand how you're trying to read what the Midrash said about the plains versus mountain commandmenting kind of things, but your explanation is not the only logical way of explaining it. And if it's not the only logical way, then you can't act like it's the only explanation. So instead, in Ramban's opinion, the interpretation of the above Baraita, meaning the Midrash from Sifra, the first part of this commentary, having torn apart someone else's. The general rules of the sabbatical year were that was a quick rebound. Amazing. By the way, for those of you that have been keeping score, the company that said they were going to replace their internet has now said, after 2 months of delays, that they're not going to replace our internet. So I'm back to square one trying to find a replacement. Joy. Okay. Let's see what we can get done. And now that I need to find where I was in my eyes. Okay, yes, the interpretation is clear, at least in Ramban's opinion. The general rules of the sabbatical year were declared on Sinai, as it is written in the section, and you feel free to open up all the little footnotes to check all of the different verses. And these are the ordinances. Ve'ela HaMishpatim, which is chapter 21, Parashat Mishpatim, comes right after the 10 Commandments. And on the 7th year, you shall let it, meaning the land, rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, like we talked about from some of Rashi's commentary. These are the laws of the sabbatical year in a general way. Here, he, meaning God, went back to the subject and said that in Mount Sinai, all of its specific prescripts were also given, since all of them are mentioned in this section. And at the end of this subject, it is written, these are the commandments which the Eternal commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai, in order to liken all the commandments to the sabbatical year previously mentioned, teaching that all of them likewise were stated in general terms and with their particular details. That is, all were declared on Sinai. And thus it was taught in the Torah Kohanim, our Midrash, these are the commandments. Henceforth, no prophet may promulgate any new thing, which the Eternal commanded Moses. That is to say, the messenger was found deserving before him who sent him, since he was the most perfect of all human beings. Moses for the children of Israel, meaning it was the merit of Israel that caused the divine glory to rest upon Moses. In Mount Sinai, this teaches that all commandments originated at Sinai. Thus far is the text of Torah Kohanim, But the reason that the laws were repeated in the plains of Moab was only for the purpose of explaining the Torah to the children of those who had left Egypt, who were born in the wilderness after the giving of the Torah at Sinai. This appears to me to be the interpretation of the Midrash, the Braita, as it is well and nicely said, which is a lovely Hebrew idiom of just saying with all the pieces in the right place. Okay, so what is Ramban trying to say? He is saying, in order to understand why we say Behar Sinai here and what it's trying to unpack for us, we have to look at it not just with regards to the book of Deuteronomy, but also with regards to what we saw in the book of Exodus, meaning from Mishpatim. Because there we got a general statement of the laws of Shemitah, and here we are getting a fuller statement that gives us the logical linkage that was missing from Rashi's interpretation to say that it had been stated in general terms. Now we're being given specific terms, and these specific terms too were Behar Sinai, were at Mount Sinai, thus allowing us to say that in general, because of the later verses in this section, that all the commandments that we see were given in both their general and specific detail in Mount Sinai. That is why we get our Behar Sinai introduction. Questions or comments? Okay, I'm actually going to go ahead and stop here because I'm feeling a little frustrated with the text, and I know that if we start the next section with only 12 minutes-ish to go, there's no way we're going to get through it. But please, I highly recommend looking at the next section, in particular Ramban's commentary on verse 2, where he tries to unpack this whole notion of the 6 and 7, and it's an interesting look into the more classical mystical traditions, hinting at the notion of the length of time stretching for the world. So it's a great piece, going to be a little confusing, but that's why I know we don't have time to go through it. But enjoy and read and keep studying, and I will see you next